Kia ora koutou and welcome to the Early Childhood Seminar Series. We're very pleased to be here with you and to share our first seminar for 2022. The seminar series this year will continue to focus on showcasing research of staff and students from the University of Auckland, Faculty of Education and Social Work. And as a result of the wonders of modern technology, we will also have presentations from some researchers and academics from other parts of New Zealand and the world. Each seminar that we share with you in person or via live stream is recorded and available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. So please do go and watch or re-watch the seminars of our wonderful previous speakers. Today, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Barbara Watson, presenting from her doctoral research with a focus on the impact of social exchanges on mentor and provisionally certificated teacher relationships. The recording of this presentation will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel after the seminar. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please do use the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen to ask questions as we go, and Barbara will respond to them at the end of her presentation. Without further ado, I would like to pass over to Helen Hedges to introduce Barbara.
Thanks, Justine. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou tēnei wā. It's indeed a pleasure to introduce Barbara Watson to those of you who don't already know her this afternoon. Barbara brings a wonderful and perhaps rare depth of expertise to the seminar today. Firstly, in her professional life, she began as a primary school teacher and then moved into early childhood teaching, has been a lead teacher and a centre manager, and then moved into the professional learning facilitation work that she has continued with fantastic results. A thread of her work has always been her interest in mentoring other teachers. And to add to her expertise and credibility, she has recently completed a PhD at the University of Auckland on the induction and mentoring of newly qualified teachers. Now, Barbara didn't take the easy way with this. She undertook her research in early education and care settings that, as most of us know, receive no additional support and funding to undertake this really important professional task. And so today she's going to present to you some of her really interesting and intriguing findings with the explanatory power of a theory called social exchange theory that she came up with to help her understand her findings. The stories that she's about to tell will resonate with many of you, and we look forward to hearing from you, Barbara. So without further ado, I'll hand over.
Kia ora tātou, and thank you, Helen and Justine, for those introductions. Thank you for joining me today, everyone. It's really exciting for me to be provided with this opportunity to talk about a subject that I'm really passionate about. As Helen mentioned, it's been a thread for my work throughout my teaching career, really, and increasingly so in recent years. I feel so strongly that supporting teachers, and in particular teachers at the beginnings of their career, to be the very best that they can be is the most critical component in contributing to quality outcomes for our tamariki. And because of that, I've made it my life's work as a professional development facilitator, and continue to do a lot of work in that space, now informed by my doctoral research. So, as Helen mentioned, my study, which you'll hear more about shortly, took place in education and care services. Deliberately, I didn't investigate induction and mentoring in kindergartens, not because I don't like kindergartens, of course, but because the existing research in New Zealand had been already conducted in the kindergarten setting for the most part, and I wanted to touch into what was happening in education and care. The findings from that study inform my presentation today, and I'll share, as Helen said, and as the title of the webinar indicates, 5 vignettes or stories that illustrate the impact of social exchanges within the relationships between PCTs, so that's the term that I'll be using instead of provisionally certificated teachers, which is a bit of a mouthful, PCTs and their mentor teachers. So to give you a bit of a framework understanding of my research overall, we'll start with a few slides explaining that. So my study was a case study that took place in 3 education and care centres that were purposefully chosen to reflect the main types of governance and management arrangements found in the sector. So I'll share a little bit more about the details of that a little later. There were 23 participants in my study, and they reflected the range of roles within the induction mentoring programs. So they included a professional services manager from a large organisation, 2 leaders that were not in mentoring roles, a mentor who was also the manager of her centre, 3 mentor teachers who were not in other leadership positions, 5 PCTs and members of the teaching teams in each of the 3 centres. The data was gathered in 3 phases. So firstly, I conducted focus group interviews with each teaching team and followed these with individual interviews with the main players, so the leaders that also included the professional service manager, the mentor teachers, and the provisionally certificated teachers. And the data that I received from the interviews and focus groups really focused on the espoused views of the participants. In other words, what they said happened and what they said they did within the induction and mentoring programs in their centres. Phase 2 involved the mentors video recording episodes of their mentees' practice, and then followed up with the subsequent conversations that took place between the mentor and PCT. And these cycles of observation and conversation and the triadic discussion that I had with the mentor and the PCT about those conversations was repeated to capture patterns over time and also possible changes over time. Now that data was really interesting because it revealed what actually happened and therefore how well aligned or not this was with what people said happened. So you'll hear more about that a little later as well. And then finally, I finished with a further round of individual interviews that allowed me to gather information about the shifts in thinking and in practice that had occurred over the course of the study. My research drew on 2 theoretical frameworks. So Helen's mentioned social exchange, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly, but also I used Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory. So many of you will be no doubt familiar with his ecological theory and the sort of Russian dolls nested model of spheres of influence on an individual's learning and development. And that idea resonated with me because of the various roles that the PCT at the heart of the induction and mentoring program, the mentor, the teaching team, the leader, the professional services manager for the large organisation, and then out to the Ministry of Education and the Teaching Council, or the Education Council as it was still at the time of most of my research. So that ecological layers that were of influence on the PCT's practice. But the bioecological model of Bronfenbrenner focuses on the people, the processes, the context, and all of those things happening over time. And so it seemed to be a natural fit for my research. But the theoretical framework that's really at the heart of today's presentation comes from the field of sociology, and it's called social exchange theory. And I chose this because it seemed likely to contribute some explanations about how and why the individuals involved in induction and mentoring programs acted in the way that they did, why they did do some things and why they didn't do other things. So this theory, in short, proposes that people engage in relationships to the extent to which the benefit of doing so equals or outweighs the cost. So that's the idea that's really at the heart of today's presentation, how people's perceptions of the benefit that they were receiving and the cost they were incurring within the induction and mentoring program affected their interactions and engagement within it. For those of you who are interested, my overarching research question was, how might a bioecological frame explain the complexity of providing effective induction and mentoring in education and care centres? And I had the 4 sub-questions outlined here, and you'll see that the 3rd and 4th ones of these deal with the enablers of and constraints to effective induction and mentoring programs. And the vignettes that I'll present today demonstrate that the nature of the relationship between a PCT and their mentor plays a significant part in either mitigating against the constraints and minimising the effects of those, or diminishing the enabling effects of structural things that might be in place. So this is one of the key findings of my study. And just to talk about some of the enablers and constraints big picture, Helen's already outlined one of the biggest constraints in the education and care sector, and that is the lack of dedicated funding for induction and mentoring programs. Other structural constraints are things like a lack of professional learning opportunities for mentors. Mentors in my study were all first-time mentors and had received no preparation or professional learning for their role. They had taken it on because they wanted to give back to the profession as they had received when they were professional certificated teachers themselves. And not only my research, but other research, notably Francis Langdon's research in the primary sector, also out of the University of Auckland, shows very clearly that mentors tend to mentor in the ways that they were mentored themselves, which over time becomes outmoded, outdated, and certainly there were some constraining factors in some of the approaches that mentors had experienced themselves as mentees and then were passing on to their provisionally certificated teachers. Research also shows that having a poor mentor is often worse than having no mentor at all. And this was of real interest to me because I was concerned that provisional certificated teachers might be collateral damage of perhaps well-intentioned but ill-informed mentoring practice. So those are some of the things that sit behind some of the constraints. Also, often in education and care centres, the governance structures allocate what time, what money, what resource is given to induction and mentoring programs, both in terms of time and also professional learning opportunities and things like that. And if the owners or the people who hold the purse strings are not really invested in or don't really highly value mentoring, then it doesn't get resourced in the way that it would in perhaps kindergartens and certainly in schools. So some of the constraining factors there. On the other hand, enablers, by and large, the mentors that I worked with were really keen to do a great job and were actively engaged with their PCTs, trying to do the very best they can in the absence of training, professional learning opportunities. There were some resources provided by the Teaching Council, most notably the guidelines for induction and mentoring that were enabling, and also in some services the centre leadership did resource and gave in session non-contact time for induction and mentoring to happen. But my research and also other research shows that this is very variable in the education and care sector. So just a few of the enablers and constraints that I've highlighted there. So moving on to my centres. So the first of the vignettes that I would like to share with you is Acton Terrace, I've called it. It's obviously a pseudonym for the centre name. This was a privately owned centre and owned by a couple, one of whom was a certificated teacher herself and still actively involved in leading the centre. She had been previously the mentor teacher for provisionally certificated teachers, but had passed that on to her staff, her other teachers, as she grew her services. So she had 3 centres at the time of my study. So Brenda had acted as mentor for Maria, who was the mentor at the beginning of my study. As I said, she was a first-time mentor who was in the positional leadership role in her centre. She had grown up overseas. She was highly ambitious, and in fact, partway through the study, she left to be a centre manager at a bigger centre because she saw that as the next step for her. She was really highly engaged in supporting her provisionally certificated teacher, but there had been no formal professional learning given to her the role. She was doing the things that Brenda had done with her in her induction and mentoring program. When Maria left the centre, Hayley took over as the mentor for Emma, who was in her first year as a provisionally certificated teacher. And Hayley was a Māori woman, much closer to age than Maria had been to Emma. And she was highly collaborative in her approach. She was a member of the team rather than a positional leader. And so there was not a hierarchical definition between them. They were working alongside each other as equals within the team. And this did have a significant impact on their relationship. The centre was well provisioned in terms of non-contact time for induction and mentoring activities, and very actively engaged in professional learning more broadly. So I would say that they had quite a strong professional learning culture in the centre, but that none of that had been deliberately targeted at building mentor capability. So within that context, a little bit more about the people and their relationships. So Maria, in her relationship with Emma, said that she only gave suggestions on request and said that she was very supportive of Emma in finding her own way of being a teacher, exploring for herself, finding her own solutions. However, observations and conversations showed that she actually gave a lot of suggestions, and because of this positional difference and also because of age. Emma was a Chinese, of Chinese origin. She'd been brought up in New Zealand, but she was of Chinese origin and held people who were older than her in high esteem. And so, although this relationship was very positive, very smooth, it was actually pretty much Emma doing the things that Maria told her to do. And Emma was happy to do that. She saw that Maria was able to share a lot from her experience. And so Emma was actively involved in that relationship. However, when Maria left and Hayley became Emma's mentor teacher, there was a much more equal dynamic between the two of them. They didn't have the hierarchy of the centre differentiating their positions. And Hayley's approach was much more collaborative than the sort of apprenticeship style of Maria's mentoring. And so Emma really flourished under that type of mentoring and became much more confident, much more engaged in making suggestions about her practice and what direction she felt she should go in. She felt that she had a lot of commonalities culturally with Hayley, even though one was Chinese and one was Māori. She felt that there was a lot of commonality in their beliefs and values, and that made their professional discussions much more equitable than they had been with Maria. And so in this relationship, there were similar understandings of the purpose and process of induction and mentoring. There was the difference between Maria and Hayley's apprenticeship and collaborative approaches. The hierarchy definitely impacted on Emma's freedom to express her ideas and to be an autonomous decision maker herself. And Emma said that she didn't actually realise what she had been missing working with Maria until she had had the experience of that collaborative relationship with Hayley. And I think this is quite telling, really, because we only know what we know, don't we? And if we don't know what a really collaborative, co-inquiring relationship looks like, feels like, then we don't know when it's not there necessarily. So this relationship was very productive. The relationship with Maria was also productive, but with Hayley it was more productive. And it was interesting, some of Hayley's observations within the relationship too, because she said that initially she realised that she was talking quite a lot when she listened back to the recordings of their conversations, but she changed that because she had that collaborative ideal that she was working towards. And that they became much more collaborative inquiry and problem solving. And as I said, Emma became much more independent in leading her own learning. So this Maria and Emma's relationship was working, it was productive, but it wasn't as productive or as engaged as the relationship between Hayley and Emma. The next story that I'd like to tell you, quite a different picture. So this centre, I'll call it Bella Vista, was a community-based centre in a similar geographical location to Acton Terrace. But at the time of the research, they were under serious budgetary constraints. So that led to some structural constraints, like there was no non-contact time for induction mentoring activities, and the two partners, the mentor and PCT, met in their weekends or in the evenings to complete the induction and mentoring work. They also, other structural constraints, the PCT worked in a different room to her mentor, and so there were limited opportunities to have those just-in-time casual conversations and to observe each other's practice. The centre had previously used an external mentor, and this was particularly telling because Tanya, who was also a first-time mentor, had had this external mentor when she was a provisionally certificated teacher, and she highly valued that external expertise. Somebody who was a relative expert in mentoring, that was their job, to mentor across a range of services. And Tanya really valued that induction and mentoring process that she had received, and she tried to duplicate that approach with her PCT. So her PCT was a teacher who had been teaching for 20 years, but this was at the time when the Teaching Council had just brought in the requirement to move to full certification within 6 years. And so there was a time frame that Julie had to move to becoming fully certificated, having held a provisional certificate for 20 years. She was much more experienced as a teacher than her mentor Tanya was, but also a lot less theoretically minded. She admitted to being a practical teacher and not much into reflection, really, were her words. In contrast to Tanya, who was a very reflective teacher and who loved aligning practice or with theory or drawing theory back into her practice. So this was a really challenging relationship. Tanya didn't have the skill to be able to work through the differences of the disparate beliefs and values that they had. So Julie believed that, keeping documentation in the induction and mentoring program was a waste of time. She was an experienced teacher and she was only doing this because she had to. She believed that she was already a good teacher, and theory and reflection didn't really have too much of a place in her mindset about teaching. Very contrasting to the views that Tanya had, who she really highly valued professional learning and was continually questioning her practice as a teacher. They also had disparate motivations, as I've mentioned. Julie was engaged in the induction mentoring program because she had to get fully certificated, otherwise she would need to do a teacher education refresh course, which she didn't want to do because it cost money that she didn't have. And Tanya was desperate to provide really strong induction and mentoring in the way that she had received herself as a provisionally certificated teacher. They also had different understandings about the purpose and processes of induction and mentoring. Tanya believed that the induction and mentoring process was about getting feedback on practice in order to be able to reflect on it and to improve outcomes for children. Julie, the provisionally certificated teacher, felt that the process within induction and mentoring was all about Tanya checking her work to make sure she was doing it right so she could get signed off. So very different understandings and motivations. Now, this relationship, although they throughout the study remained very close collegially, in their words, the induction and mentoring program imploded. they just got to a point where they just felt, we can't go any further, this just isn't working. And so they both agreed to push pause on the induction and mentoring process until they could get some support and work through and find a more productive way of working within that relationship. They were increasingly frustrated, and it meant that both of them were pulling back and becoming less and less engaged in the relationship. They were still got on really well within the teaching team. There was no animosity or ill feeling or anything. It's just that this relationship in the induction and mentoring program wasn't working. Even though Tanya had tried to modify her approach to meet Julie's more practical way of working, but Tanya didn't have the skill to be able to work through those differences, and she freely admitted that. She just didn't know what to do when Julie didn't shift her mindset, as Tanya was trying to accommodate and find different ways of working. So that relationship was neither positive nor productive in the end. They did eventually work through and come to Julie did move on to become fully certificated under Tanya's guidance, but they had to get some external support to help them through that sticky patch. Vignettes 3, 4, and 5 are they all took place in the same centre as part of a large organisation, and therefore had the extra layer of support provided by a professional services manager that wasn't available in the private or community contexts. So that organisation, that extra level of professional services manager, she described herself as a mentor to the mentor, and that's how the mentor also described the professional services manager as well. But in actual fact, that didn't that vision for their relationship wasn't actually played out in practice. The PSM expected the mentor to ask when she needed support or information, but the mentor said that she didn't know what she didn't know and therefore didn't know what to ask, and so she didn't. She was doing the best she could without direct support. Once again, Lily, the centre manager, was a first-time mentor, and she was mentoring 3 provisionally certificated teachers in her service. One was a second year, just entering her second year as a PCT, and the other 2 were first years. Because it was part of a larger organisation, there were some enabling factors contextually. They had networks of PCTs that met from time to time. They also had, as I said, the PSM who could give some guidance around mentoring. They also had information about induction and mentoring that the other centres didn't have, because they had those higher levels of structural organisational support to get information from the teaching council, for example, and to filter it down. So they had some stronger systems and processes in place around the expectations for induction and mentoring programs. So I'll now share brief stories about Lily, the mentor, in regards to each of the 3 PCTs she worked with. And this is really interesting to me because it shows that although in the same context, with the same structural, contextual enablers and barriers, the relationships between the mentor and the PCT can be very different for a number of reasons. So firstly, Lily and Jasmine. Jasmine was the second year PCT. She was also of Chinese origin. She was seen as somebody who had strong leadership potential, and she had similar beliefs and values to Lily, her mentor. Lily saw Jasmine as being quite similar to herself, very perceptive about children's learning, very focused on her own learning, very reflective, and she all of those things as positive, obviously, reflective of herself, and also really desirable attributes for a teacher. So because she found Jasmine quite similar to herself, she found it easy for her to work with her. There was an ease in their relationship. There was, things just flowed naturally. They could have really good, robust discussions. Jasmine felt confident to ask questions. She felt confident to challenge Lily's ideas and to work things through. She was prepared to listen to Lily's point of view because she valued it highly. And so there was a really high level of engagement in the induction and mentoring process, and in their relationship more broadly as team members. So this relationship was both smooth and productive. And throughout the study, Lily became more educative in her approach, I guess, partly through what she saw as the benefit of engaging in the research that we were doing together. And there were also significant jumps in Jasmine's confidence and leadership, her ability to step into that leadership, and so much to the extent that she was promoted to be a centre manager soon after she became fully certificated. So a very productive, easy relationship. It was easy for both to be engaged in, and so they were highly engaged, in contrast to Tanya and Julie, which was fraught. It was a difficult relationship, and so they both withdrew in that relationship. So in the same context, we have Lily and Susan. Now, Susan had come to teaching as a mature student. She had started her qualifications in her early 50s. She described her educational background as being really challenging. She was dyslexic and not particularly successful at school. And she said that she had become a qualified teacher after being a teacher aide in primary schools for a while. She wanted to become a qualified teacher to show her father that she could do it. So that's quite a powerful motivation for her, a real driving force. She and Lily had very different beliefs and values. So Lily was very child-led, and Susan had a very high value on what she called family values, in particular manners. So my first observation of Susan, or the observation that Lily did of Susan's practice that I watched via video recording, was of Susan sitting with 2 infants and formula tins and pegs, and she was giving the infants the pegs, and they had to say ta before she would give them the peg to put on the formula tins. So very, very high value on manners and pretty teacher directed. So Lily viewed those aspects of Susan's practice as problematic. It didn't fit with the centre's philosophy, didn't fit with her personal beliefs and values about effective teaching. They initially had different understandings about induction and mentoring, the purpose behind it, but this was clarified through ongoing discussions. For example, Susan felt that Lily's role as her mentor was to be a friend, and Lily saw it very differently. She saw it to be a colleague and a challenger, as well as a supporter, definitely not a friend. But what was interesting about this relationship, even though it was really challenging for Lily to work with Susan because of these disparate beliefs and values, she really relished the challenge and saw it as a professional learning opportunity for herself. And so she was actively engaged in trying to find strategies that she could use to raise these things in conversation with Susan, and to work through some of these issues of her practice. Susan was, as I said, highly motivated to be successful, and so she highly valued Lily's expertise. And so what happened throughout the course of the induction and mentoring program, or the part of it that that was within the scope of my study, my final observation that I received from Susan was of her being a resource for children as they got her to lie down. This was old children, as they got her to lie down, and then they would mark, and then she would stand up and lie down at the next place. And it was how many Susans did it take to get from one side of the room to the other. Completely teacher-led, very, very different in terms of her practice. And that example of her practice was typical of the practice by the end of my research. So that was really exciting to see the outcome of that very productive relationship, even though it wasn't easy. And then finally, Lily and Eloise. So Eloise was a first year provisional teacher, and she was not engaged to the extent that Jasmine was. Her practice wasn't problematic to the extent that Susan's was. And so Lily found her okay to work with, but not particularly interesting or challenging or easy. They did hold similar beliefs and values. Eloise said that she found the documentation of the induction mentoring process onerous and meaningless, and so she did a minimum of that, and Lily valued those things, and so she saw that lack of documentation as a lack of engagement, which I'm not actually sure was the case. So they had similar understandings about the purpose and the process, but their practice wasn't particularly well aligned. Once again, Eloise was fairly teacher directed, not to the extent that Susan's was, and therefore it was not as problematic, and therefore not as interesting or engaging for Lily to work with. And so it was really interesting that because Lily found her relationship with Eloise neither particularly easy, nor particularly positive, nor particularly challenging in a good way, she actually felt that she let Eloise down. She wasn't as engaged with Eloise as she had been with the other two PCTs, who she had found more engaging for quite different reasons. So the relationship was smooth, everything went okay, but it was relatively unproductive. Neither of them were particularly well engaged. So those last three vignettes were particularly interesting to me. They were all interesting, of course, but those three vignettes with Lily as the same mentor, but how her relationship was very different with each of the three provisionally certificating teachers that she was working with, I found fascinating. And I really feel that the social exchanges that were happening within those relationships is what tipped the balance to them being either successful or not. So the next slide that I'll share with you is part of the conceptual framework that I came up with, the model that I developed as a result of my my research. There are other things on the model, but they're not relevant to today's presentation. So in this model, you'll see the dark strip down the middle is like the core of induction and mentoring. And as you move out, it's about the PCT and the mentor, and then the leadership on the next layer. And I haven't included the big picture macro systems of the teaching council and the Ministry of Education in this particular diagram for this presentation, but there were some things in those columns as well. And there are a number of inhibitive factors that meant that the social exchanges were likely to be not great and not sustained. And you can read them there. The lack of skill to negotiate through to common understandings. So that's Tanya, I'm thinking of there. Mismatched motivations and mindsets. So once again, Tanya and Julie, and to a lesser extent, Maria and Emma in the first vignette that I shared. A lack of clarity and support. So if Tanya and Julie had some clarity, if Tanya had the skill to be able to work through, then perhaps that relationship wouldn't have imploded. But because it was frustrating to them both to the extent where it was just untenable, the induction and mentoring relationship was fractured. Similarly, at the leadership level, there were some factors that were impacting on the induction and mentoring programs in each of the three centres. On the other hand, there were some facilitative factors that meant that even in difficult circumstances, such as the one between Lily and Susan, that was able to be worked through and become very productive. In fact, probably the most productive of the relationships in my study. So that ability to be reflective and skillful about mentoring practice, not just about teaching, but about your own mentoring practice as a mentor, and to be able to negotiate your way through those challenging circumstances. Understandings of roles and responsibilities. So Lily had the conversation with Susan, I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to support you. I'm here to challenge you. I'm here to collaborate with you and co-construct with you. And she had that conversation to clarify the nature of the relationship. Also, Lily found satisfaction in the relationship she had with Susan, even though it was challenging. And similarly, Hayley, in her relationship with Emma, she recognised pretty early what she didn't know as a mentor and started to work differently because of it, and found that change really rewarding and much more aligned with her own personal beliefs and values than the previous ways of working that had been influenced by her mentor. And proactive support and interest from leaders, definitely an enabling feature, as well as prioritising induction mentoring systems and processes within service and facilitating learning conversations. So my argument here is that even when there are some challenges or circumstances that are not ideal, if you have good social exchanges, good relationships where both people see a benefit in that relationship, you can mitigate some of those challenges that are occurring structurally. On the other hand, if the relationships are not rewarding in terms of social exchange, like, for example, Tanya and Julie, or Lily and Eloise, then even really good circumstances may not be enough to carry that relationship through and to make the induction and mentoring process productive, or as productive as it might be. So I guess what's hopefully you might be most interested in is, what does all of this mean? You know, Barbara's research is fine, but not every centre is those 3 centres. But what are the implications for practice? Well, first of all, I would say that selection of a mentor and the active development of them, so that they have the skills to lead teachers' learning, to really lead those conversations and to work through those gnarly situations that happen from time to time. For example, in Tanya and Julie's case, if Tanya had the knowledge and the skill that she needed to be able to work through those disparate beliefs and values in the way that she ultimately did after she got external support, then their relationship wouldn't have imploded. It would have been building and moving really positively. If somebody had perhaps said to Lily, hey, what's going on with your relationship with Eloise? It doesn't seem to be as active as with the other 2 PCTs. Maybe that external support in terms of raising that question might have got her thinking about how she could be more actively engaged in that. Or if they had had a conversation with Eloise about her level of engagement in the process, that might have had the same effect. So I know that this is a tricky situation because we have a teacher shortage in New Zealand at the moment, and a lot of really highly skilled, experienced teachers are deciding to leave the profession. So perhaps it's not as easy to select those who are really skilled and knowledgeable as it might otherwise be. But certainly active development, rather than putting somebody into a mentoring position or having somebody step into a mentoring position and then having them realise, oh, crikey, I haven't got the skills, I haven't got the knowledge that I need to do this really well. So leaders need to put some resource into building mentoring capability. It's going to benefit not just the provisional teachers that they're working with, but the whole team, and ultimately, of course, our tamariki. The next big implication, I think, is matching of mentors and PCTs. And once again, this isn't always possible, or certainly not easy, but to maximise the chance of positive social exchanges. So if Julie had been matched with a more experienced mentor who did have those abilities to have really challenging conversations and to sort of work through those issues, then perhaps that could have been more successful. Perhaps Julie would have become more engaged. It's not always possible, of course, to match, but where it is possible to match similar beliefs or values or similar priorities, it can certainly be leading to more productive and sustained engagement in mentoring relationships. This here, I think, is a really important point, is that at the beginning of an induction mentoring program and ongoing throughout it, there needs to be an ongoing exploration and renegotiation of the roles and responsibilities within the relationship, because as a PCT becomes more experienced over the period of their induction and mentoring program. And as they become more capable as teachers, their needs will change. And so some of their thinking might change. They might need different approaches from mentors. And so that ongoing, what do you think a mentor is? What do you need from me as a mentor? And vice versa, what do I think a PCT's role is, and what I need from my PCT if I'm going to be engaging in this relationship in a way that sustains us both and doesn't lead to negative social exchanges and perhaps disrupted or fractured relationships. So I think that that's something really key, that these things are made explicit, roles and responsibilities, and that those are renegotiated, not assumed as static over the 2-year or more engagement with mentors and their provisionally certificated teachers. And finally, and this is a biggie, but it's unavoidable, is the resourcing and recognition of the importance of the mentoring role. Now, in education and care, we don't have that external funding that schools do, but it does say in the licensing criteria that centres have the responsibility, or leaders in centres have the responsibility, to support PCTs to full certification. And that means an induction and mentoring program. And that doesn't just happen with no input. So input into teacher development, mentor development, I should say, and time and recognition of the extra skill and expertise that a mentoring role involves. So I would love to, and I have advocated for external resourcing in the early childhood sector. But at the moment, we need to be just looking at the internal resourcing that we can make available to give our beginning teachers the very best support that we can. So that's all I have for my presentation. I'll throw over to Helen to ask me some questions, I guess.
Kia ora, Barbara, you're right. Firstly, I want to thank you for a great presentation. It was a really well designed and theorised study to get to the heart of what actually happened in the induction and mentoring practices in those 3 settings, and then to be able to share with us today to explain why it was related to the value of the induction and mentoring. So there are 2 questions that have come up for you. The first one is, what did support Tanya and her mentor? And was it, it's a 2-part question, was that similar or different to what came together for Lily and Susan?
Okay, so really good question. So Tanya and Julie got some external support. Tanya accessed support from the person who had been her mentor, and also beyond the scope of the research, because the successful part of their relationship was outside of the scope of the research that I did in terms of time and data collection. But I also had some ongoing conversations with Tanya and her other mentor as well, to build her ability to address some of those things directly with Julie, and to have those conversations about, you know, where being reflective, for example, sat within the standards for the teaching profession. And this wasn't an optional extra, but it was something that she needed to develop the skill to. And, you know, those questions can be quite tricky to have. So yeah, myself and her other mentor supported her over a number of months to practice those conversations ahead of time, and then to she had those conversations, and gradually things improved with Julie. So it was different from Lily, because Lily was engaged in it was the first time she'd been a mentor, but she'd been a centre manager for a while, and so addressing issues of practice was something that Lily was familiar with, and she did quite a lot of reading and reflecting, and also asking Susan directly in their conversations about why she did the things that she did, and drawing parallels back to the centre philosophy and the agreed values of the philosophy. So Lily's was much more self-driven and came out of her reading and reflection, whereas Tanya's was direct input from external experts. Well, I don't know, experts might be a presumptuous, relative experts.
Yeah, thank you. I think, that answer really does indicate exactly what you've invited us to think about, and that's that understanding the complex interpersonal enablers and constraints accompany the structural that we're all thinking of. So, and the other question that came up just related to something you said towards the end there about fully certificated teachers leaving centres quite quickly. Just what implications are there from that point for induction and mentoring?
Well, vast. If traditionally, or induction and mentoring has tended to sit with people in positional leadership roles, and anecdotally, it seems to be that because those roles are so time pressured and complex, induction and mentoring is something that is often dropped off the to-do list, not because people want to, of course, but just because there are other more urgent tasks that need to be addressed. So when we're losing experienced teachers, and even when we're not losing experienced teachers, I would really advocate to build capability from within the team in people who are not in leadership positions, as a sort of in my thesis I talked about a parallel career progression, so a progression that's fairly well defined, I think, into head teacher, centre manager, and then often sitting in the office, versus teacher into mentor, and that working alongside building teacher capability I see as another really important role in centres, to separate sort of centre management and pedagogical mentoring type leadership. So I would advocate that as far as is possible, centres build that capability within the team, so it's not the professional leader necessarily that's taking on the mentoring role. But increasingly it's becoming difficult for centres to have mentors internally. But if there are external teachers leaving teaching and perhaps relieving, or wanting something different from full-time teaching, then they may be really good to develop as mentors. So there's the possibility, it's to my awareness, it's not happening to a great extent currently, but there is a possibility for organisations to, or even networks of centres, to pull together to identify and develop somebody who could be an external mentor across multiple settings. It's not a simple answer, and it's I think it's a time for people to be increasingly creative and look outside the box for solutions.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and thank you for that. We're just running a little over time, and a couple of other questions have popped up that are way too big for you to answer right now. So I certainly would invite the two people who popped them up to approach you. They relate to what then would a really good induction and mentoring program look like, and what sort of professional learning could people engage in. So in that regard, I certainly invite all of those who've been with us today to contact Barbara, because that is her job, that is her role, that is her business. And I'm sure she will welcome your contact if you would like to engage her for advice and support in induction and mentoring. Again, thank you, Barbara, a really interesting presentation, and I'll just hand over to Justine to close today.
Helen. Yes, thank you so much, Barbara, for your presentation this evening. You've really highlighted that the relationships and interactions between mentors and their mentees are the central contributor to both enabling or constraining the success of an induction and mentoring program. And you've really given us some useful points to consider whether we're in the role of the mentor or in the role of the mentee. So thank you for that. And I hope that take the opportunity to follow up with you, because it is such an important area for us to continue to develop in the early childhood sector. So we hope that everyone watching has found this seminar thought-provoking, and that it has provided inspiration for your own practice and thinking about mentoring and relationships in early childhood contexts. And we look forward to seeing you all back for our next seminar, which will be advertising soon. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and registration information. And thank you again for joining us this evening. Kia kaha, kia ora, kia ata whai, ka kite anō.